Welcome to part 2 of our series on cooking with shell beans. My name is Victoria Faoro, and I look forward to sharing some of my favorite recipes for entrees and a dessert. Be sure to also watch part 1, which includes much general information about cooking beans, as well as recipes for snacks, soups, salads, and sides. Full recipes are included at the end of each video. One of the reasons I highly recommend serving shell bean entrees is the fact that beans are such a healthy food to include in your diet. If you haven't been eating them regularly, you may want to start with some of the sides and salads in part 1 to introduce them gradually into your diet. Beans can cause gas in the digestive system because they contain a great deal of fiber and oligosaccharides. These sugars are difficult for our bodies to digest, so they can ferment in our digestive system. There are various promoted remedies, but the best way to avoid problems is to introduce beans gradually in your diet and then eat them regularly. The recipes we're featuring include both those specifying canned beans and those specifying dried beans. In truth, you can use either for all of the recipes. A half cup of dried beans will cook up to about a can or 1.5 cups of cooked beans. That's about a 15-ounce can. Let's now look at making some entrees featuring shell beans. Crispy black bean patties are a nicely spiced alternative to meat burgers. They're good eaten in a bun, but we actually prefer them on their own, with a dressing of plain yogurt, cilantro, and lime juice. Here we're enjoying them with some roasted butternut squash and broccoli stems. You can make these with canned black beans or beans that you've cooked. Whenever you cook dried beans, it's important to first sort them for debris and even small stones that get mixed in. I spread them on a baking sheet and pick out any debris or shriveled beans. Then I wash them and drain them. I usually cook dried beans in my stovetop pressure cooker with aromatics like onions, celery, carrots, and garlic to give them added flavor. You can also cook them in an open pan on the stovetop or in an electric cooker. For this recipe, you want to cook them until they're very creamy. I test for doneness by rubbing a bean between my thumb and first finger. It shouldn't feel chalky or gritty. I try to cook a large batch and freeze some for using later. I store them and freeze them with their cooking liquid. I've discovered that it's a lot easier to manage packages of frozen vegetables in my freezer if I freeze them in flat packages, rather than full-bottomed, rounded bags. These flat bags stay stacked more easily, and I always label anything I'm freezing with the contents and the date. Ingredients for this recipe include drained black beans, fresh cilantro and fresh dill, scallions, coriander, cumin, lemon zest, and egg white, a small amount of cornstarch, and salt and pepper. Don't skip the dill. It really combines well with the cilantro. You can finely chop these ingredients by hand and mash the beans in a bowl. But instead, I usually pulse the beans and other ingredients in a food processor. I put everything in at the same time, but for added texture, you could put half the beans in, process everything into a coarse puree, then add the rest of the beans, just pulsing a few times. No matter how you chop and mash, when you're done, an egg white is folded into the mixture to lighten it a bit and help bind it. First, the egg white is whisked until it's frothy. I recently learned that it's much easier on your shoulder to whisk by flicking your wrist back and forth across the bowl than to whisk in a circular motion, which uses your whole shoulder. It doesn't matter much with something like this, but if you're whisking a sauce for 10 minutes, it can really make a difference. Next, fold in the egg white. After refrigerating the mixture for 30 minutes, you form quarter-cup portions into patties. You can fry these in a skillet on the stovetop, but I've discovered that they also bake well. I put just 1 teaspoon of oil in a heavy oven-proof skillet and heat it in the oven. Then I add the patties and bake on the bottom rack for 5 minutes on each side, and they come out crispy, as on the right. This uses much less oil, which is always healthier. As I mentioned earlier, we like these patties with a simple yogurt, lime juice, and cilantro sauce. The patties can also be halved or crumbled and eaten wrapped in a tortilla with vegetables and the yogurt sauce. You'll be surprised how satisfying these crisp bean patties are as an entree. If you're looking for a nutritious bean filling for a tortilla, this curried chickpea recipe is excellent. And if you wrap the mixture in a collard green rather than a tortilla, the entree becomes especially healthy. To begin making this filling, rinse canned chickpeas or cook dried chickpeas until very creamy. Dried chickpeas can be challenging to thoroughly cook, so be sure to check several to make certain they're done. Dried beans are not sorted, so the size can vary greatly. Coarsely chop an assortment of vegetables. I usually use carrots, celery, and onions, but you could use any vegetables you want. Next, put about 2/3 of the chickpeas in a food processor. Add the olive oil, water, tahini, garlic, lemon juice, and curry powder, and puree until smooth. Because the pureed chickpeas become a sauce, this filling needs no mayonnaise or other binder to hold it together. Next, add the remaining chickpeas and just pulse a few times to break them up a bit. You can keep them somewhat chunky or keep pulsing to break them up more. I like them chunky myself. Put the processed mixture into a bowl and return the food processing bowl back to its stand without washing it, because now we're going to process the vegetables. Add the carrots, celery, onions, or whatever other raw vegetables you're using and pulse them to chop. I like to chop these fairly finely. Stir them into the chickpea mixture and add toasted cashews and dried cranberries and mix. This curried chickpea mixture has a great deal of texture and contrasting flavors. It can be eaten on a bed of fresh greens as you might eat tuna salad, used to fill a wrap, or spread on a slice of bread. I especially like it served in a collard wrap, so let's look at making one. Collard greens work well as wraps because their leaves are flat and fairly large. Collards are also much more nutritious and lower in calories than corn or flour tortillas. The leaves do need to be prepared, though. The first thing I do is slice off part of the thick vein. It's easy to do by running a paring knife horizontally, the length of the rib. Some people use the leaves raw, but I parboil them so they're more tender. I drop them into boiling water for about 3 minutes. Test a piece to be sure you'll be able to easily bite through it in the finished roll. Then I drop them in a bowl of ice water to stop the cooking and help retain the beautiful bright green color. This is a step you can take with other steamed vegetables to retain their color. After they've been drained and laid out on a clean kitchen towel, it's time to make the roll. The leaves vary a lot in size. I always trim off the pointed end at the bottom. And if the leaf is gigantic, I'll also trim down the sides a little. This leaf was a good size, so I didn't. The scraps can be thrown into a soup or frozen for later use. Put a row of the filling across the trimmed end. Fold the sides in over the row of filling and then complete the roll, keeping everything as tight as possible. These store very well as the wrappers don't get soggy the way a tortilla might. When I serve them, I slice them in half. The contrasting colors are beautiful and the combination is delicious. They're savory with spices and very creamy with contrasting crunchy nuts and sweet cranberries. I always have trouble not eating a lot of the filling on its own as soon as it's done. I've also made these smaller and cut them into bite-sized pieces as an appetizer. This next dish has become our go-to New Year's Day black-eyed peas meal. It features collard greens too. I like to make it with dried black-eyed peas so a great broth is produced during the cooking, but you could also use canned beans and their liquid. For this recipe, the collard greens are cut into ribbons if you're going to spoon beans over them, or cut again lengthwise if you're going to add them to the beans. Often with greens we strip the leaf from the stem. Note that for this recipe, the veins or stems are left on. I like to use country ham for this recipe too. I buy packages of bits and pieces, cut the packages into quarters, wrap them individually, and freeze a bag of them so I can pull out one or two for a dish like this. Before using the dried black-eyed peas, remember to sort them. Notice the small stone I found in the bag I used for this recipe. I put the peas into my pressure cooker with the frozen bricks of country ham, an onion with 2 cloves embedded, bay leaves, black pepper, allspice, and salt. You may think you don't want to include the allspice. We tend to think of that as a spice for sweet baked goods rather than savory dishes. Do try it. It really adds a great deal to the dish. Cook according to your pressure cooker instructions. You could also cook on top of the stove for 1.5 to 2 hours. On the right are the beans after the initial cooking. If the ham has gone into the pressure cooker as a frozen chunk, it will be easy to pull out the mass and chop it. If your ham wasn't frozen when you used it, you could chop it before you cooked it. Next, saute garlic and red pepper flakes in oil in a large pan. Add the strips or smaller squares of collard greens and stir to coat them all with oil. Add a 1/2 cup of water and stir to wilt the greens. Then put a lid over it and simmer. If you've pulled the ham out to chop it after cooking, you can add it to the collard greens. When the greens are tender, if they're strips, put them on a serving dish and spoon the beans on top for serving. If the collards are in smaller pieces, simply stir into the beans and simmer to warm all through. I usually add them to the beans. Serve the mixture with thinly sliced or chopped scallions over it. The blend of flavors is a great way to start the new year, or enjoy a healthy meal any other time of the year. White chicken chili is another dish we make with beans a lot. It was my husband's traditional winter game day meal. And over the years, I've learned that it doesn't need to be all white. I often mix white and other beans to make a satisfying combination. As with many dishes, most of the work is finished before any cooking begins. I trim and chop chicken. I don't usually use much chicken, just enough to give the dish some added texture. You can use whatever amount you want. I'd like to dice my vegetables in fairly large pieces. Here I'm using onion, celery, green and red peppers, and I've also diced up some kale, stems and all. I've peeled the garlic, but not yet trimmed it for mincing. I saute the vegetables first. In this case, I'm using just peppers and onions. The recipe lends itself to using whatever you have on hand. You can see I have all my prepared additions positioned, ready to be added during the cooking. Chefs refer to this as mise en place, everything in its place. This time I'm adding some cubed zucchini. Since it cooks very quickly, I added that later in the process. I also have my spices measured out. The spices are added and the chicken and all are sautéed for a few minutes. If I'm adding greens, I do it at this point. Then the drained and rinsed beans are added, and I stir all. Then add the broth and simmer. Canned beans are cooked when you buy them, but I find they do benefit from being cooked for 10 or more minutes. This is great served sprinkled with chopped scallions or onions. You can make it as thick or thin as you want, cooking it down or adding more broth. You can see in this batch I've even added pinto and black beans. Our last bean entree is tuna white bean casserole, which is a healthier alternative to that favorite comfort dish, tuna noodle casserole. It can be made with no pasta, but I find it a little more satisfying with a small amount of pasta added. This recipe uses white beans. I've chosen to use cannelloni beans, a white kidney bean, but you could use any white bean. Lemon zest is also included. I've used a microplane to prepare that. I've left the zest on the microplane so I can put it directly into the dish. Much of the flavor is in the oil, which can be absorbed by your cutting board. This way, the oil will all go into the dish. You can use the herb of your choice. I had dill on hand when I made this batch, so that's what I've chopped. The beans are partially mashed for this, to create some creamy sauce. I like to leave at least half unmashed though, so I have more texture in the finished dish. Sauté scallions with red pepper flakes if you choose to add them. I always do. We enjoy a little heat in our food. White wine is added. You could use broth or even water if you prefer. Remove from the heat and add the remaining ingredients including milk, tuna and its oil, thinly sliced garlic, the dill and lemon zest, and Parmesan cheese. Also add the pasta if you're using it and stir. Pour all into a casserole dish and sprinkle with cheese. Bake for 20 minutes until bubbling. The result is creamy comfort food with less fat and calories and more fiber and nutrition than traditional tuna casseroles. Our last recipe is for a bean-based dessert that will really surprise you. My husband and I were shocked to suddenly realize that black bean brownies have become our favorite brownies. Black beans are used in place of flour in these bar cookies, so the first step is to cook dried black beans until they are very creamy, or rinse and drain canned black beans. Puree the beans with canola oil in a blender or food processor. Put the puree in your mixing bowl and add eggs and vanilla and mix. Combine the dry ingredients in another bowl: cocoa powder, sugar, baking powder, salt, and instant coffee. I use instant espresso. This ingredient is optional, but coffee always gives chocolate a deeper flavor. Mix the dry ingredients into the wet, then add the chips. I like to use bittersweet chocolate. Pour the batter into a greased pan and bake at 350 degrees. Depending on how long you bake them, they can be fudgy or cakey. Slice them when cool. They're a lovely texture and a deep chocolate flavor. You would never know that they contain black beans. Hopefully you've learned of some shell bean recipes you'd like to try. Following our full recipes, remember you can pause the video at any time to photograph or copy down a recipe. The first recipe is for crispy black bean patties. The next recipe is for curried chickpea spread and includes directions for using the spread in collard wraps. Here is the recipe for black-eyed peas with country ham and collard greens. This recipe is for white chicken chili. Remember, you can modify the vegetables and use a combination of different colored beans. This is the last entree recipe for tuna white bean casserole. And this is the recipe for black bean brownies. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video, click on the link to subscribe to my channel so you're notified when I post a new video. Click on the left-hand link to view part 1 of Cooking with Shell Beans, which features recipes for snacks, soups, salads, and sides. On the right is a link to another program, Cooking with Fall Vegetables. Follow the Madison County or Fayette County Kentucky Cooperative Extension sites for additional programming information. When in-person classes are being held, I present some cooking programs there. Happy cooking!